10:30 a.m. back on the record.
So have you been able to review the email?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so I think the way this works is that this will display on your screen, and then I can highlight sort of the things that I have questions on. So directing your attention to the back page, this is an email from Victor Borelli to yourself, and I believe Victor was one of the national account managers. And he says, you see, okay, can you read the sections that I've highlighted?
Sure. Both Sunrise Wholesalers and Masters Pharmaceuticals are both out of Oxy 15 milligram and Oxy 30 milligram and have orders in-house on back order. Sunrise has both PO 259 and 261 on back order and are bone dry on all products listed on both POs. We have displaced all competitors at this account, and they are relying on our supply to cover their demand. If we don't ship it, they can't sell anything.
Okay, and so does this indicate that Mallinckrodt is the sole supplier to Sunrise on Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 milligram?
Based on the statement, we have displaced all competitors at this account and they are relying on our supply to cover their demand, indicates to me that we are their only supplier.
Okay, and the reference to PO 259 and 261, that's a reference to Oxy 15 and Oxy 30?
I can't specifically say that because he talks about the 15 milligram and 30 milligram in the first paragraph, but he doesn't reference them specifically in the second. So I would assume, but I can't completely confirm.
Okay, but Sunrise is, your understanding of the email is that what he's saying is that Sunrise is out of Oxy 15 and out of Oxy 30. And Mallinckrodt is a sole supplier of those products to Sunrise. Is that fair?
That is my interpretation of the email.
Okay, and then Masters, if you see on the bottom it says Masters Pharma has a PO that is back ordered since late October for 7,992 bottles of Oxy 30. They also have a 31,968 bottle order, PO 1644, that is on back order as well. And so this would also be in reference to Oxy 15 and Oxy 30. Is that correct?
This one looks like it's just related to Oxy 30, but yeah, I think 15 and 30.
Okay. And do you recall these types of shortages with respect to Oxy 15 and Oxy 30?
We did have shortages, back orders, yes.
Okay. And just so we're on the same page, what is a back order?
A back order is when a customer places an order with you and you do not have the supply and or you choose not to fill the order.
And when you say you choose not to fill the order, what are reasons you might not fill the order?
Depending on our allocation strategy, in terms of what customers, if we were low on inventory, then we might determine to allocate the product to one customer over another, or we might choose to partial allocate, and that would be a time where you would not choose to fill an order.
Okay. Now, turning the page over, can you read that highlighted section into the record, please?
Sure. We are essentially stocked out of oxycodone 15 milligram and 30 milligram. This is largely the result of our previous quota shortage and playing catch up. They are working hard to make the product, so it will release next week. When it does, I will take care of your customers to the best of my ability.
Now, the sentence, this is largely the result of our previous quota shortage and playing catch up. What is a quota shortage?
So to be clear, within the opioid market, and specifically if we want to talk about Oxy, the DEA granted Mallinckrodt a certain amount of API, active pharmaceutical ingredient, quota for the year. So we were only able to manufacture as much as the DEA allowed us to based on the raw material quota or amount that they gave to us. And that's of the oxycodone raw material. So we would apply for quota, the DEA would grant it, and then you would have to reapply throughout the year and wait for them to grant the quota request to you until you had the approval for API quota or procurement quota. And again, I wasn't in the conversations. This is again from my perspective within marketing, just seeing what they did in terms of working with the DEA. You would reapply for quota, the DEA would grant it, and then at that point, only then would you be able to actually manufacture product.
So I guess is the issue that the demand for Oxy 15 and 30 outstripped Mallinckrodt's quota at some point in time?
Object to the form.
Yeah, I don't think that that's necessarily, number one, I can't answer that because I don't have the numbers in front of me. And number two, not the one who was working with the DEA, so I'm not an expert within that area. What I will tell you from my recollection is that you would apply for what your annual quota needs were at the beginning of the year, back in, let's say, end of the year for the next calendar year, and the DEA never granted it in full. It was always, you were always in a case of having to reapply throughout the year. So it's not necessarily a linkage to demand outstripping what they had approved us for.
And so just so I understand it, you would the quota is measured in terms of API, is that right?
From my understanding.
Sure. And so, and an API, is that a rough approximation of a pill? Is that sort of the unit of measurement, or?
No.
So what is API measured in?
API is active pharmaceutical ingredient, so it's going to be the raw material that is used to manufacture the finished dose. So typically API is managed in kilos.
Okay. And so you would request, let's say, 50 kilos for your annual quota.
I would not request, but someone within another area would be working with the DEA to make those requests.
Okay. So Mallinckrodt requests, let's say, 50 kilos from DEA. DEA would, what would, when you say that DEA wouldn't grant it in full, so they would grant you, let's say, 30 kilos and allow you to reapply for the other 20, or I'm trying to understand how that system works.
Sure. You would really need to talk to somebody who was in charge of that process, because I'm only speaking from memory, and this was from 8-9 years ago.
Well, but what's your recollection of sort of in terms of how it impacted your job? You're describing a quota shortage.
Mm-hmm.
So what is, when you said it's a quota shortage, what did that mean to you?
So I think you need to understand the DEA allocates quota to the entire market, so not just Mallinckrodt, but to other generic suppliers within the market. So they've got a set quota they will allocate to manufacturers across the market. Does that make sense?
I believe so.
Okay. So then so if they've allocated quota, they'll do it. You provided a forecast to them, and this is really the only role I play. Is you provide a forecast to them in terms of what you think you're going to sell for that next year. Now, I'm looking at the dates here. 2008, there was significant market disruptions. I believe there was at least one, maybe two competitors that had recalls within this market during this time frame. However, they had already been allocated quota by the DEA at the beginning of the year. So when they recalled product and they were no longer able to sell it, we were in a position where we had only asked for a certain amount of quota to meet our forecast for that year. The forecast changed because these two competitors, direct competitors, I believe it was two again, went out of the market, and we were in the position of our forecast going up because we were going to take on that market share, or we're trying to. So we had to reapply to the DEA for additional quota because we only had enough quota to meet our baseline demand that we had established.
And so when you say a quota shortage, that means, are you referring to the fact that Mallinckrodt didn't have the legal, well, strike that. Are you referring to the fact that Mallinckrodt, under its quota, couldn't manufacture more product to meet the back order? Is that what this email is saying?
So again, the DEA had, let's think about like a pie. And they've got a certain amount of quota they're going to allocate to meet the demands of the total, let's say, oxy market.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, let's say Mallinckrodt, when we applied for quota, had 30% of the market. And again, this is hypothetical. And then our other two competitors had 70%. We would have applied for enough quota to meet 30% market share. When those other two competitors, and again, I'm just hypothetically speaking, had recalls and exited the market, that left this other portion of the market unfulfilled, the developed market. The DEA had already granted them quota because they are only granting to a finite amount to service the market. So we had to go back and reapply to the DEA to try to get additional quota to try to grow our manufacturing capabilities to meet the unmet needs that were left because of the recall within the market. So yes, that would have been, when we said there was a quota shortage, that's what we would have been referring to.
And so the issue here is that I guess Sunrise wholesalers and masters were coming to you because, or potentially because, of this recall, and they were seeking to increase the product they were getting from you. Is that fair?
I think that that's a fair statement. It's tough to say because I don't remember the exact timing. But when it talks about displaced competitors, I do believe that that was a result of market shortages, but I don't know 100%.
Okay. And so when you say, when it does, I will take care of your customers to the best of my ability, what did you mean by that?
Because we were in a backorder state and we had other customers that had back orders as well, we were in a position that when we did have inventory, we were going to have to allocate. So we were going to have more open orders than we had inventory to ship.
And were you in charge of, with respect to the oxycodone product, deciding how to allocate the product among the different orders?
From a business perspective, I was the one, because I was in marketing, I was the product manager. From a business perspective, I made decisions about who we would want to allocate product to based on relationships, based on importance of their total book of business, based on the length of back order. So from a business perspective, I was working with the sales team and with my management to make those decisions. But that was outside of the scope, so that was one path that was outside of the scope of anything to do with the suspicious order monitoring. So mine would strictly have been from a business relationship side.
Okay, and so just so I understand, you've got 5 different distributors,
Mm-hmm.
and they each have, let's say, 20 bottles on back order.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, they are owed 20 bottles by Mallinckrodt under the whatever sales agreement they have. Mallinckrodt only has 50 bottles; it doesn't have 100.
Mm-hmm.
And you would determine sort of where those 50 bottles, how those 50 bottles were divided among the 5 different distributors. Is that fair?
I would play a part in that, yes.
Okay. Who would ultimately decide what the allocation was, given that you had, the number of back orders exceeded the volume of product?
So I would drive it based on historic demand. So we would look at what they had historically ordered, and then we would ascertain of that what percentage we thought should go to certain customers based on their relationship and their book of business. I would provide that information to customer service in conjunction with the sales team, so we would arrive at that number, and then it would go through, obviously there was the other steps that were taken in terms of just looking at the order as a whole, and does it meet the terms of our suspicious order monitoring in terms of releasing it. So there was a couple of different people who ultimately touched it before it went out the door, before the okay happened.
And in terms of the allocation, though, you would look at the importance of the relationship and the book of business.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that, you would say, okay, I've got 50 bottles to allocate. I'm going to give 20 to A, 30 to B, and C, D, and E get nothing. Does that hypothetical make sense? Just in terms of how the process might work.
I think that's what I stated to you already, yes.
Okay. And then at that point, your decision to give 20 to A and 30 to B, that's subject to the suspicious order monitoring program?
They would be executing that in tandem with the process that I was looking at, yes.
Okay. And presumably, let's say the 5 different distributors are, well, the different national account managers have responsibilities for the 5 different distributors.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine each national account manager is presumably going to want his customer to get some portion of that quota. Is that fair?
It was the sales team's job to manage the relationship with the customer. So they would be advocating for their customers to receive product if it was the right thing to do. And it was our job internally to see the big picture and then to make the final, decisions.
Okay. And so when you say to Victor, when it does, I will take care of your customers to the best of my ability,
Mm-hmm.
what you're talking about, what that sentence means is, or strike that. When you say when it does, I will take care of your customers to the best of my ability, you're referring to the allocation process, meaning that you're going to try to allocate product to his 2 customers, which would be Masters and Sunrise?
I said I will take care of your customers to the best of my ability. So I don't ever say that I will or won't allocate to them. I'm just addressing the fact that he's put in the request.
Okay, so these are his customers. I assume multiple customers have back orders.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to advocate for his customers to get them their product. And he's, I guess to some degree, pitching you or asking you to allocate to them. Is that a fair understanding of this email exchange?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. And you recall this occurring in 2008 because of recall issues. Do you recall similar shortages in 2009?
I don't remember.
Okay. Do you recall similar shortages for the other products that you managed?
We had back orders, but I don't remember specifically timeframes or products.
Okay. So do you have, I believe this is Exhibit 5. So this is an email that's Bates numbered MNKT1 4916278, and it's an email from you, Miss Neely, to various people, including what appears to be many of the national account managers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall drafting this email?
I don't recall drafting it, no.
Okay, but you don't have any doubt that you sent it?
I did send it, yeah.
Okay. And then looking on the screen, do you see the reference to you've done a tremendous job of meeting historic demand?
Yes.
What did you mean by historic demand?
Well, if you continue to read the email, it says, however, in light of the ethics recall, we have all been challenged with the influx of orders. So the timing of this is February of 2009, and if you reference the last email we talked about, that was November of 2008. and that was when I had spoken to the fact that there had been a recall within the market. So if you look at the first, the first paragraph of this email, it says, in light of the ethics recall. So when I talk about historic demand would have been our demand, what our baseline demand, which is what I spoke to you about in terms of applying for the quota initially from the DEA. That would have been our baseline demand prior to the ethics recall. And so what I'm highlighting here is that we've been able to meet our historic demand, been able to service our customers in the manner that we historically have been able to. However, we have not been able to meet the orders that we have been receiving because they had escalated as a result of the ethics recall.
So in terms of the chronology with respect to the quotas, though, the quotas were set on a yearly basis?
So I think what we spoke about earlier is that you apply for your quota at the beginning, you get granted your quota at the beginning of a calendar year, and then you come, and if you have to reapply for more quota, then you do so throughout the year to the DEA.
So this is a 2009 email. The last email we saw was November of 2008. So in early 2009, Mallinckrodt would have been applying for its DEA quota, with knowledge of the recalls, wouldn't it?
We would have been granted, so we would have applied at the end of 2008 and been granted our quota for 2009.
Okay. But when you applied in late 2008, presumably your quota would have reflected your assessment of the recall situation, wouldn't it?
I can't speak to that specifically because I didn't do the application, but one would assume, yes.
Okay. So, so when you say, however, in light of the ethics recall, we have all been challenged with the influx of orders we have been receiving and how to best manage them. Is this still a quota shortage issue, or is this now a manufacturing issue?
So you would need to speak to someone in manufacturing to truly understand lead times. But if you're granted your quota, your manufacturing and your procurement quota at the beginning, so let's say on January 1st of 2009, regardless of if you applied for that quota with the understanding of the ethics recall or not, you still have to convert that raw material into finished goods. So you're looking at a lead time there in terms of manufacturing. Now what that lead time is, I don't know. But if you're already in a backorder situation by the end of 2008, and then you get your quota at the beginning of January of 2009, and we're looking at February of 2016, so a month and 15 days later, you still have to assume that you are coming into this at a deficit, and not only that, but you're having to manufacture with a lead time. So of course we're still going to be in a situation that we can't fill all of the orders that have been left.
And I'm sorry, you said February of 2016.
I said February 6th, I'm sorry, February
okay.
16th of 2009. My
Okay,
apologies.
got it. In other words, even if you have the expanded quota from DEA, you still need to make the product. Is that
Yes,
fair?
100%.
Okay. Now, so can you please read that paragraph that I've just highlighted?
You want me to read the second paragraph?
Yes, the second paragraph.
Okay. After maximizing our manufacturing output, we know that we are not in the position to fulfill the total market demand as a result of ethics exiting. Therefore, we are going to begin managing our customer demand, or more appropriately, making them aware of what and when we will be able to ship based on our manufacturing output. Allocations per customer will be based on historical demand from the months of September to November of 2008.
Now you say ethics exiting. So I take it their product was recalled. Do you recall them ever re-entering the market, or were they done?
To my recollection, ethics did not re-enter the market.
Okay. So to the degree that Mallinckrodt's market share increased because of ethics exiting, this was a permanent condition.
Object to the form. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't. Market share within the generics industry is never, you can never say it's permanent.
But you didn't have to deal with ethics as a competitor again after they left.
Ethics, if they didn't re-enter the market, would have no longer been a competitor on this product.
And so, is it fair to say that the demand in 2009 increased from strike that. Is it fair to say that with respect to Mallinckrodt's Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 products, the demand in 2009 was greater than the demand in 2008?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I can't speak to that.
Though but wouldn't the fact that you're experiencing shortages and manufacturing shortages suggest an increase in demand?
One would assume that based on this email, but I would assume that, but I don't have the numbers in front of me to state unequivocally that it did.
And do you have any recollection of the demand for Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 increasing over the 2008 through 2011 time period while you were employed at Mallinckrodt?
Again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I can't tell you directly.
Well, but even without the numbers in front of you, I mean, do you have a general recollection of what happened to demand for these products?
There was a lot of market dynamics and shifts that I believe that happened within the Oxy IR market. And there was growth, but I don't know how much, and I can't remember exactly when it occurred.
But you were employed at Mallinckrodt between 2006 and 2011. Is that? Do I have that?
That's correct.
That day right? Right. And you were the product manager for Oxy from 2008 through 2011. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And so during that time period, is your recollection that Oxy? I understand that there were market dynamics, but is your recollection that Oxy demand generally increased?
Again, I don't have the numbers, and it's been a long time ago, so I can't speak to that specifically.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the requirements of the Controlled Substances Act?
Yes.
Okay. And what are those requirements?
I was made familiar with them whenever I worked for the company during the training time. I haven't worked with controlled substances since I left the company in 2011, so I can't state them to you directly.
Okay. Was it your understanding that a manufacturer had a duty to know its customers?
I wasn't in the compliance group, but based on the training that I received, that would have been my understanding.
Have you ever heard the term indirect customer?
I have heard the term indirect customer.
And what does that term mean to you?
So an indirect customer would be when we sold to a wholesaler, and then the wholesaler sold on to a pharmacy and onto their customer. That customer was an indirect customer to the manufacturer.
Okay. And what about the term downstream customer? Are you familiar with that term?
That one I'm not as familiar with, no.
Okay. What about end user? Are you familiar with that term?
For us, for a manufacturer, an end purchaser is going to be the pharmacy that ends up with the product. So, for instance, if we sold it to CVS, that would be an end purchaser. If we sold it to Cardinal, who then sold it to CVS, CVS again would be the end purchaser. So from a manufacturing perspective, that was our end purchaser.
So is end user and indirect customer, are those interchangeable terms?
Direct and indirect customers are interchangeable, those two together, with end customer, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. So I understand the direct customer and I understand the indirect customer.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the end user, though, the end user is interchangeable with the indirect customer, or the direct customer, or both?
So we would sell direct to pharmacy chains,
Mm-hmm.
and then you would have pharmacies that would purchase indirectly through wholesalers.
Okay.
So you have direct and you have indirect purchases. The combination of the two resulted in sales to an end purchaser.
Understood. Was it your understanding that a manufacturer had a duty to know its indirect customers?
Object to the form? Go ahead.
Again, that would have fallen into compliance, and that's something I don't feel comfortable answering.
And when you say you don't feel comfortable answering, is that because you don't know what the answer is?
It's because I have not worked in controlled substances for over 8 years, and I truly don't remember.
Would you agree that there is an opioid crisis or opioid epidemic in this country?
I don't know.
Have you ever heard the term opioid crisis or opioid epidemic?
I have.
And in what context did you become familiar with that term?
Most recently, I suppose, in the news.
Okay. While you were working at Mallinckrodt, do you ever recall hearing that term, opioid crisis or opioid epidemic?
I don't remember.
And as you sit here today, you don't have any understanding of whether there is an opioid crisis or opioid epidemic.
I don't really know. I mean, you see things in the news. I don't really know, though.
Do you believe there's a problem with opioid abuse in this country?
I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Do you know what a pill mill is?
I have become familiar with what a pill mill is, yes.
Okay, and what is a pill mill?
From my understanding, a pill mill is where patients know, and again, this is, they know they can go there, and doctors are more freely writing prescriptions for different medications.
Is it your understanding that certain regions have more pill mills than others?
That part I really don't know.
Do you believe Mallinckrodt has an obligation to take reasonable steps to prevent its product from reaching pill mills?
Again, I wasn't in compliance. I was in marketing. This has been 8 years ago. From my perspective, Mallinckrodt had an obligation to control diversion at the part of the supply chain that it had the impact on. So in terms of the distribution of its product into the customer base.
But Mallinckrodt had no obligation to try to combat diversion at the distributor level, did it?
I don't know the answer to that.
And is it your understanding that Mallinckrodt didn't have an obligation to try to combat diversion at the pharmacy level?
Again, I don't know the answer to that.
So when you said Mallinckrodt has an obligation to fight diversion, what do you mean by that? Is it only at the manufacturing level? Is it throughout the supply chain? You know, what is Mallinckrodt? What is your understanding of Mallinckrodt's anti-diversion obligations?
Sure. I can't speak to the diversion policy that they have or what they have in place. From my recollection, when we were there, we had suspicious order monitoring, and we had a strong compliance group led by Karen Harper. Those are questions, though, that really would need to be answered by her. That was her wheelhouse, and that was her expertise.
And so with respect to pill mills, though, was it your understanding that Mallinckrodt had an obligation to prevent pill mills from acquiring its products?
I don't have a good answer for you on that, no.
Okay. Looking back on your tenure at Mallinckrodt, are there steps you believe Mallinckrodt should have taken or should have taken sooner to try to prevent diversion from occurring?
Can you say that question again?
Sure. Looking back on your tenure at Mallinckrodt, are there steps you believe Mallinckrodt should have taken or should have taken sooner to try to prevent diversion from occurring?
Well, I would say again that the compliance group was in charge of the suspicious order monitoring and in charge of putting together the programs to monitor our orders and the product being shipped out. So that really fell into Karen Harper's group. I would say from a marketing perspective and from what visibility that I had, I saw that group working diligently and extremely hard to put in place or to execute, I should say, on on suspicious order monitoring programs to ensure that our product was being shipped. I don't know what the right word for this would be, but being shipped in the most conscientious way possible.
And so do you believe that those programs were effective?
I can't speak to that because I don't know what you mean by effective.
Well, did they stop the Mallinckrodt products from being acquired by the pill mills?
Object to the form.
Yeah, I don't think that you can. That's too many what ifs down that stream. I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Well, were they effective at preventing Mallinckrodt's products from being provided to distributors that did not have adequate diversion control programs?
Object to the form.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think that again you can't answer that question because how did we or how do they qualify what a pill mill was? So I don't think that there's no way to answer that question. It's impossible to make that linkage.
Are you aware that certain of Mallinckrodt's customers had their licenses revoked by DEA for diversion-related activities?
I am aware of that.
Do you believe or do you understand that Mallinckrodt had any obligation to try to prevent its products from reaching these customers?
Again, that's a question you would have to talk to Karen Harper about. I was in marketing and that is really outside of my wheelhouse.
So your role was just to provide information to the compliance department?
Much of my role was to provide the data to the compliance group, yes.
And I believe you indicated that you were a conduit for data. Is that correct?
That's what I stated earlier, yes.
So in terms of being a conduit, though, you were getting the data from where, and you were providing it. Well, where were you getting the data that you were providing to compliance?
Sure. So in terms of the data, a lot of times it would be the chargeback data. So sales information.
So is it fair to say that you were essentially providing information from the sales database and the sales team to compliance for them to make their decisions?
I think that's a fair statement.
Okay. And so compliance in this regard was dependent upon the data it received from the sales team.
Object to the form. Go ahead.
So there was, I don't think it was necessarily from the sales, no, that's not an accurate statement.
Okay. Well, so in terms of being a data conduit, you were providing information to compliance from what source?
From, I think we already talked about this, from the chargeback data.
And did you ever talk to the sales team about their customers or the nature of their customers?
I believe that I would have talked to the sales team about their customers, yes.
Okay, and would you have provided that information to compliance?
I would have relayed the anecdotal information from the sales team to compliance, yes.
And compliance presumably would have relied on that anecdotal information that you were relying in terms of making its decisions. Is that correct?
Object to the form. Go ahead.
I think that would be a portion of what they relied on, but it was never 100%. Or you can't even say that. It was a factor, but it wasn't necessarily always the driver in decision making.
Okay, so what were some of the other factors or drivers then that
I can't
compliance
speak
looked
to
at?
that. I provided compliance with the sales information, and beyond that, the other factors that Karen and her team factored or that incorporated into, you would have to talk to her about that.
Okay. But if the information you were providing to compliance wasn't accurate for whatever reason, that would be a problem, wouldn't it?
Object to the form.
I can't speak to that. Karen would have to talk about that and how that would hurt her decision making.
So did you have So this is exhibit, I believe, 6. Why don't I just pass it over to you guys, okay? So Ms. Neely, I'm handing you an email and attachment. The email is marked as MNKT1633048, and the attachment was produced in native form, but it's 6330419.
Okay.
Okay. So this email is from Amy Loomis to a number of people, including yourself. Do you recall receiving this email?
I don't.
Okay. The text of the email is another long list of orders hitting excess demand rules. And then the attachment, I believe, is a list of the various orders that, hit those excess demand rules. Do you know why you're receiving this email?
I don't remember, no.
Do you know what is meant by excess demand rules?
I don't know what the exact definition is in this context.
Well, what's your understanding of the general definition?
My understanding of excess demand would be an order that exceeds what their historic average order had been. Average order history had been.
Okay. And so in terms of how this list gets generated, I assume there are orders coming into Mallinckrodt, and then those orders are screened against some type of numeric formula. Is that consistent with your understanding?
I don't, this fell into Amy Loomis. She was in logistics planning. I don't know how she set it up. It appears to be that way looking at the spreadsheet, but I don't know.
Okay. And then what did you do with this list after you received it?
I truly don't remember receiving this email or this attachment, so I can't tell you what I did with this.
Okay. Did you have any role in reviewing these orders?
Again, I couldn't tell you because I don't remember getting the spreadsheet.
Well, do you recall receiving, spreadsheets similar to this during your time at Mallinckrodt?
I'm going to be honest with you, I truly don't remember.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, taking a step back, what was your understanding of the suspicious order monitoring program that Mallinckrodt was implementing? Well, strike that. What was your understanding of the suspicious order monitoring program that that existed at Mallinckrodt while you were there from 2006 to 2011?
Yeah, and I know, and again, apologize, but I really, at the time, I was well versed in it and I could have spoke to it. I don't remember. It's been 7-8 years. I really don't remember the specifics of it.
Well, do you know if a numeric formula was used to screen the orders?
In looking at this spreadsheet, it appears that that's the case, but I, again, don't remember.
Okay. Do you recall being involved in reviewing or evaluating suspicious orders?
It appears that I was, because I was on this email and there was an attachment here, but I don't.
Okay. Well, so do you recall anything about the process for either identifying suspicious orders or for reviewing them?
Again, I don't remember the exact process, no. I know that there was there was a program in place, and at the time was, again, well versed in it, but this is an email from over 11 years ago, 12 years ago. I don't remember.
One, I understand that your testimony is that you don't remember the exact process. I guess my question is, do you remember anything about that process?
It appears that there were according to the spreadsheet, that they had thresholds in place to identify orders that looked larger than usual, but I don't remember how that was done or what was done with this information.
Okay. Yeah, 449492. Oh, I've got it, okay. Okay, here you go. Okay. Okay, so Ms. Neely, this is an email base numbered 449492, and it's an email chain between you and others. And I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom email that starts on 492 and carries over to 493.
Okay.
Okay. And that email, it's an email from you to Victor Borelli, and it CCs Michael Dunning and Ginger Collier. I believe Ginger Collier was your supervisor, is that correct?
She was, yes.
And who was Michael Dunning?
He was the head of sales and marketing.
Okay. And the Key Source Vault program, what is that?
So in order to store controlled substances, specifically Schedule II drugs, you have to have a special vault within your warehouse required by the DEA to store Control 2, or Schedule 2, I should say. And that particular storage facility was called a vault.
Okay. And do you see at the top where you say, per our conversation regarding Key Source and the proposed vault program, we are not planning to proceed for the following reasons. And then the first bullet point is rolling 12 months versus rolling 12-month sales are 99%.
Okay.
Rolling 12 months versus prior rolling 12-month sales in Florida are 1,364%.
Yes.
Do you see that? What does that mean?
So
Or what is the significance of that data point?
it's stating that their sales are up almost 100%, but then it's saying that within the state of Florida, they were up significantly higher than their average sales across all of their territories.
Okay. Well, I mean, and significantly higher, it's 99% versus 1,300%. Is that correct?
That's what the email states, yes.
Okay. And then the second bullet point is KMI, which I assume is Key Source, right?
Yes.
It says Key Source sold 8.8 million in net sales for the past 12 months, of which 78% is oxycodone IR. For the past 3 months, that percentage has increased to 100%. So, does that mean for the past 3 months, all of Key Source's sales have been oxycodone?
According to this email, yes.
Okay. And then the next bullet point is KMI's total oxycodone IR sales for the past 12 months. 94% of them have gone through the state of Florida. So this is, the primary sales area for them is Florida.
That's correct.
Okay. And the next bullet point is oxycodone IR sales represent to our total Mallinckrodt portfolio 23% of total net sales. Oxycodone IR sales are almost 100% to KMI net sales. So do you see that, what I'm underlying?
I do.
And so that indicates that 100% of what Key Source is purchasing from Mallinckrodt is oxycodone. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's what it says in bullet point 2 and bullet point 4.
Okay. And so essentially the reasons that Mallinckrodt is not willing to go through this, to do the proposed vault program for Key Source, is that they have a very large increase in their Florida sales. They are selling, for the past 3 months, they have sold nothing but oxycodone. 94% of their oxycodone sales are going through Florida. And the only thing Key Source is purchasing from Mallinckrodt is oxycodone.
That's what this email states.
Okay. And these were all factors of concern for Mallinckrodt, weren't they?
Let me look at the timing. So this was 2010, July of 2010. By this point in time, yes, that was concerning.
Okay.
Or there were definitely, I shouldn't say concerning, questions around their sales, yes.
Well, there were questions and there were concerns, weren't they?
There are definite questions, yes.
Okay. And then it says, given the DEA situation in Florida and the fact that key source is so heavily indexed in the state of Florida, we do not want to do anything that might be perceived as driving oxycodone sales in that state.
Mm-hmm.
What is the DEA situation that's being referred to?
So by this point in time, this would have been after certain distributors had been shut down because of their sales into the state of Florida. So it was starting to get more scrutiny, if I remember correctly.
Okay. And when you say certain distributors have been shut down because of their sales into the state of Florida, do you recall roughly when those distributors were shut down?
I don't remember the timing. I know, and I know it probably had occurred by this point because that's why we're talking to it. And then I left in January of 11, so but I don't remember when. No.
Okay. But when you left, you understood that sales into the state of Florida were a cause of concern.
I knew that we had questions around it. Yes.
Okay. And then you state, we do not want to do anything that might be perceived as driving oxycodone sales in that state. Do you see that?
I do.
It's there. What do you mean by that?
Like I mentioned, by this point we had questions around sales going into the state of Florida based on other distributors having their licenses taken and information that was being communicated by the DEA. And so we were starting to realize that there was a potential situation, and we were trying to wrap our arms around it at this point. And the last thing that we wanted to do was to further the these sales there while we were still trying to figure out what was happening.
Well, and how could you drive sales in, or what actions could Mallinckrodt have taken to drive sales?
That's a good question. Mallinckrodt can't actually drive sales. So the market is established by the prescriber writing the prescription. So the market's established by that, and then Mallinckrodt fills demand from our wholesalers and our distributors. So in terms of driving sales, we can't actually drive them. But what we were looking at here is seeing that KeySource was selling a lot of oxy and selling a lot of oxy into the state of Florida. And essentially we're looking to build out their vault space so they could accommodate more Schedule II drugs. And while we were trying to understand what was happening within the state of Florida, the last thing that we wanted to do was give a customer the ability to warehouse more Schedule II drugs without completely understanding what was evolving in the state of Florida, where it seemed like a lot of their sales were going.
Well, and there were things that you could do to encourage the sale of oxycodone, couldn't you? So, for example, you could offer to sell oxycodone for less than your competitors. That would result in presumably more purchases from you, wouldn't it?
That would result in more demand, which we talked to earlier in terms of market share. So the market would have already have existed, but it would have resulted in more market share for Mallinckrodt, resulting in sales.
Yeah. And if you were to supply distributors that other manufacturers were not willing to supply, that could also have the effect of increasing demand, couldn't it?
I can't speak to that because I don't know what other manufacturers' strategies are.
Well, but regardless, if you have a distributor and the only
Or what other manufacturers' strategies are, sorry.
Well, if you have a distributor and the only place they can get Mallinckrodt products from is, if you have a distributor and the only place they can get oxycodone from is Mallinckrodt, and you fulfill those orders, you are facilitating those sales, aren't you?
Again, I can't speak to whether or not they were able to obtain the product from another manufacturer. I only know what Mallinckrodt was selling out. So whether or not we were making a sale to someone who was buying it from us because they couldn't get it from it, we wouldn't have had a purview into that.
Understood, but for example, we looked at a prior document relating to Key Source, and Key Source, Mallinckrodt was Key Source's sole supplier for oxycodone. Do you remember that?
Did we look at that today?
Yes, I believe it's, I think it's exhibit, I believe it's Bates number 563714. It's an email from Victor Burley to you. It was the one that started with help.
Do you have it?
Yes. Exhibit 4.
Okay.
And then it's on the back page of Exhibit 4.
Oh, so it wasn't Key Source. That's why I didn't
Oh,
remember.
I'm sorry. It's Sunrise.
It's
My
Sunrise
mistake.
and Masters. Yep.
But for Sunrise, you were the sole supplier for Sunrise. Is that correct?
According to that email, yes. But we're talking about Key Source right now.
And so if you don't supply Sunrise, they're not selling anything to anyone. Isn't that fair?
Are we talking about Sunrise now?
Yes, we're talking
Okay.
about Sunrise now.
Okay. Jumping back and forth a bit. It says we have displaced all competitors. So whether or not we have displaced them because they chose not to buy from another manufacturer or that manufacturer chose not to supply to them, it doesn't say that in this email.
Well, but regardless of the reasons that Sunrise, that Mallinckrodt has become the sole supplier to Sunrise, if you continued, if you refuse to provide products to Sunrise, then they have nothing to ship and sell. Isn't that, that's a logical statement, isn't it?
I don't know because I wasn't running Sunrise's business.
Well, but isn't that what Mr. Borelli is saying to you? If we don't ship it, they can't sell anything? Do you?
Well, they
you see
couldn't
that?
sell any of our product, no.
And in fact, they couldn't sell anything because you were the sole supplier to them.
I don't know if they could have had options to reach out to other people. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, but isn't Mr. Borelli telling you that you've displaced all the competitors, so they don't have any other sources?
We did displace the competitors, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't reach back out to one of them. And that's the part that I don't have visibility into.
Okay, but assuming that by displacing the competitors, that meant that Sunrise couldn't go and obtain its product from other sources, and you were their sole supplier, if you cut them off, that meant that the supply of oxycodone products into the market would decrease.
Object to the form of the question. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I don't think that that's a true statement.
Okay, why isn't it?
So rephrase, say that again.
You are the sole supplier to Sunrise. You supply 100% of their oxycodone product. On the assumption that Sunrise can't go and get that oxycodone product from anyone else, if you don't supply that oxycodone product to Sunrise, they can't sell it into the market.
So,
To the form.
yeah, and I would say that that's based, your statement has so many assumptions and what ifs to get you from point A to point B that I think that's an impossible thing to validate.
Okay, well, could you read this paragraph then?
Sure.
Okay.
Sunrise has both PO 259 and 261 on back order, and they are bone dry on all products listed on both POs. We have displaced all competitors at this account, and they are relying on our supply to cover their demand. If we don't ship it, they can't sell anything. As soon as product is released, please ship POs out via overnight delivery.
And so if you cut Sunrise off, doesn't that mean that they essentially exit the market and you're not going to have Oxy coming from Sunrise into the market?
I think
Object to the form.
and I think we've talked about this already. We don't know if they don't have other options from other manufacturers to procure the product.
Okay. Did you have any reason to believe that they had options from other manufacturers?
I don't know. I was not involved in their business. I don't know what their options were or weren't.
Is now a good time for another quick break?
Sure. Why don't we take 5 minutes?
And just looking ahead, you want to go another session after the break and then break for lunch
Um,
after that?
Yeah, what time is it?
It's 11:30 approximately.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, all right.
Please move your microphone. The time is 11:32 a.m. going off the record. Okay, we are back on record. The time is 11:44 a.m.
Okay. So prior to the break, we were looking at this email, Bates numbered 449492, and in particular, your email to Mr. Borelli. And I was focused on the phrase, we do not want to do anything that might be perceived as driving oxycodone sales in that state. And so when you wrote that, what did you mean by perceived as driving oxycodone sales in that state?
I think what we were talking about before the break was we had seen that KeySource was selling a lot of oxycodone into the state of Florida. And we at the time were realizing that there was developments happening within Florida, you know, as a result of communication via the DEA and as a result of other distributors having their license taken away because of sales into that state. And so we did not want to help KeySource to be able to expand. They were looking for additional, and again, what we spoke to earlier, looking to build vault space so they would have additional space to warehouse additional C2s to service what we were seeing were pharmacies within the state of Florida. And so we did not want to be in a position of helping them with that program while we were still trying to understand what was happening within the state of Florida.
And so in terms of driving oxycodone sales in Florida, taking a step back, you know, what were, prior to this email in 2010, what were things that Mallinckrodt was doing to drive oxycodone sales in Florida?
Object to the floor.
Yeah, I don't think that we were ever, and I think you're taking this sentence a bit out of context. I don't think we were ever driving sales into that state. The market, as we spoke earlier, existed, and we were selling into wholesalers and or distributors that were then servicing that market. So we think we ever were in a position of driving sales specifically, you know, focused onto the state of Florida.
Well, but there were things that Mallinckrodt could do to increase its market share, correct?
Mallinckrodt, as we spoke earlier, in terms of market share, had the ability to contract with different retail and or wholesale distributor customers across the U.S. To gather or to garner additional market share. That being said, those particular, you know, those wholesalers and distributors were typically nationwide. So by contracting with them, we weren't specifically focusing on the state of Florida. We were focusing on them as an account.
And so in terms of increasing Mallinckrodt's market share, you know, for its oxycodone sales, what were steps that Mallinckrodt was taking to do that?
Well, you're assuming that we were taking steps to increase our market share.
Yes.
And so I don't know if that's the case, so I couldn't tell you what steps we were or weren't taking.
Okay. Well, if Mallinckrodt offered If Mallinckrodt offered its oxycodone products for sale for less than its competitors, would that have had the impact of increasing Mallinckrodt's market share?
If we offered lower pricing to our competitor, to our customer,
Yes.
to offset a competitor and we gained the business, then we would gain market share.
Okay. And if Mallinckrodt were willing to supply distributors that other manufacturers weren't willing to do so, that would also increase Mallinckrodt's market share. Is that correct?
Object to the floor.
Yeah, and
Go
I
ahead.
think we talked to that before the break, that we don't have visibility into what other manufacturers were or weren't doing or who they were or weren't selling to. So I don't think that that's a question that I can answer.
But in terms of the market share assigned to Mallinckrodt and ways to increase that market share, one way to increase Mallinckrodt's market share would be to sell it to distributors that other manufacturers weren't willing to sell to. Isn't that
And again,
correct?
I think we've answered this question 2 times before. We don't know what other manufacturers were or weren't doing. So I cannot tell you that we picked up business because that customer was unable to purchase the product from another manufacturer. I don't have that information.
But well, I understand that, but
I don't know,
As a-
because you've asked
as
me
a-
3 times.
as a theoretical matter, if you're willing to supply distributors in the market that other manufacturers are not, isn't that going to result in an increased market share for you?
Again,
to the form.
yeah, I can't answer. I think we're talking about real information here and not theoretical, so I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay, so you have no opinion or you have no knowledge about how Mallinckrodt could increase its market share by supplying distributors that others weren't willing to. You don't know.
Again, I don't know if other manufacturers were unable or unwilling to supply to certain customers. What I can tell you is that Mallinckrodt had the ability to gain market share through contracting with different customers. Why
And how
those
did-
why those
oh.
contracts became available is not known to us.
Well, so let's explore that. When you say that the ability to gain market share through contracting with different customers, what do you mean by that?
So what we talked about in the earlier discussion, in terms of that's how generics companies go to market. So you have certain customers that make up certain market shares, and you choose to partner or you offer a price point that incentivizes them to want to buy your product, and at that point you create a contract and you contract with them to sell your product to them.
And so you're competing with other generic manufacturers for these customers, are you not?
Depending on the market, yes, potentially.
And so what are things you can do to make sure that you get the customer and your competitors don't? Other than price, are there other things?
Price is usually the key driver.
So do we have 6320438? Okay. So I believe we're up to exhibit 8. Okay, great. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Miss Neely, I've given you an email chain that's Bates numbered 6320438. And I want to start with the email on the very back, which is 6320439. Okay. Okay, so this is an email that you sent to Jeremy Stamer. Who was Jeremy?
Jeremy worked in our market share, I don't know the name of the department, is portfolio market share analytics.
And could you read that first sentence that I highlighted?
Sure. In our meeting the other day, you mentioned that you could estimate what Florida oxycodone sales should be based on population, demographics, etc., versus where they are actually tracking at.
Okay. And what did you mean when you say that you could estimate what Florida oxycodone sales should be based on population demographics?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this was 2010, so at this point, we had had enough data points coming in for us to start to see that Florida was representing on oxycodone a higher percentage to the total country than Florida sales on non-oxy related products. And we were trying to understand why. And what because it seemed high, but at the same time, Florida is where older people go to retire. It's, so you've got an older population that's aging that could be more pain. And so we couldn't understand why the sales were high there. And so what I had done was I was reaching out to Jeremy to try to understand what if the demand was warranted, or if not, what it really should be, and if it was population and demographics driving it, or if not, you know, it was helping us to try to get to maybe what a root cause could be here.
And did you reach any conclusions as to what the cause was?
At this point in 2010, July, I
Well,
don't, yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, I don't remember the outcome of this analysis.
But the analysis, your recollection is that the analysis was completed.
I don't remember.
Okay. But at a minimum, you know, the question was being asked. Is that fair?
It was obviously being asked, as you know, as read in this email, yes.
But you don't recall whether any conclusion was reached?
Well, we did eventually, late in that fall timeframe, stop shipping to different distributors that were heavily indexed into the state of Florida. So I don't know what the conclusion of this specific analysis was, but I do know what our end result ended up being.
And what was that end result? The end result was you stopped shipping to distributors that were heavily indexed into Florida. So, well, strike that. When you say heavily indexed into the state of Florida, what do you mean by that?
Well, if you want to go back to the email that we talked about for key source, where you referenced the percent to totals.
Mm-hmm.
So where we say that Oxy IR sales represent to our total portfolio 23%, and we talk about 100% to KMI. So that would be where key source is over index. So we're looking at what the percent of sales represent, and then looking at the average, and if it's higher, saying it's over index. And the same thing could be said for the state of Florida.
And so this would indicate that Mallinckrodt concluded that the demand for Florida was not justified by demographics.
I can't tell
Right.
you that because I don't remember what the results of this particular analysis.
But Mallinckrodt's actions in the fall would suggest that it believed that there was unwarranted demand in Florida, to use your words.
I think we did finally arrive at that conclusion, but I can't tell you if it was the result of this analysis or not.
But the conclusion was demand was unwarranted.
I'm sorry?
The conclusion was demand was unwarranted. It may have come from any number of analyses.
Well, the
Object to the
conclusion,
form.
yeah, the
Okay.
conclusion was is that we stopped selling to particular distributors. We can't speak to the demand being unwarranted or warranted because that's so far downstream. But we did make the conclusion to stop selling to different distributors, yes.
Okay, and why did you do that?
I think we could go back to our concerns around the situation that DEA was addressing within the state of Florida. So it was really more, you know, whether or not it was warranted or unwarranted demand is really within the DEA's purview, not ours. But what we could ascertain was that there was something happening based on the communications with the DEA and their assessment of shutting down other distributors. And from that, we're able to draw inferences that this may not be the place that we want to be operating, or these distributors may not be the people that we would want to be selling our product into. But I can't speak to whether or not a prescription was warranted or unwarranted, or if a demand was real or not real. I can't speak to that.
And so when you say that you were able to draw inferences that this may not be the place that we want to be operating, or these distributors may not be the people that we want to be selling our product into, you know, what specific inferences are you talking about?
Again, what I just noted. So in terms of the communication from the DEA with regards to the state of Florida, and then the fact that other distributors that had been selling into the state, that coupled together drove us to feel that there was something happening. Now, what it was, I think, was what we were trying to understand here, because we weren't sure. But we ultimately, based on a number of different factors, made that decision.
And do you recall when Mallinckrodt first started to have questions about Florida?
That part I don't remember.
Do you recall reading news articles about Florida as it relates to the abuse of opioid products?
I do remember reading yes.
And do you have any recollection of roughly when those articles appeared?
That part I don't remember.
And then the email goes on to say the budget for oxycodone for fiscal year 2011 is getting scrutinized fairly closely. What did you mean by in terms of the budget being scrutinized?
That's a great question. So Oxy IR in particular, and if you again look back to the key source email, we talk about Oxy IR sales represented a total of 23% to our top line sales for Mallinckrodt. So it was roughly a quarter of our sales at that time. And from a business perspective, I was trying to set budgets for fiscal year 11 and trying to understand what the financials were going to look like. And because this was such a big driver, but yet I felt like and we as a company felt like there were so many moving pieces within it, I was trying to get a handle on what that number, that sales forecast number for budget should be.
And the following sentence is having information that could reflect what our potential downside will be if the state of Florida normalizes to the rest of the country would be extremely helpful. So what did you mean in terms of Florida normalizing?
Great question. So we talk about Florida being over-indexed as a percent to total as it relates to the Oxy market versus the percentage that Florida on average represented for other products. And with Florida being more heavily indexed on Oxy, and with the scrutiny that we were starting to see from the DEA and starting to understand that there was an evolving situation there, we weren't quite certain what it completely was just yet. I was trying to understand from a dollar perspective what that difference would represent in relation to our existing oxycodone dollar sales. This was strictly from a business dollar sales projection standpoint.
And in terms of the question you were trying to answer, or I guess the issue you were trying to examine, was it a concern that the overall percentage, as you indicated, roughly a quarter, that was going to go down when Florida normalized? Is that correct?
It wasn't necessarily a concern. I think we need to be careful about that. It was more about setting realistic sales numbers for our fiscal year. And, and if that number dropped because the total market for oxycodone dropped, then I needed to accurately relay that and be able to support it within our budget. So I wouldn't say it was a concern. It was more about trying to get to the accuracy of what was going to happen.
And there was, at least in your mind, a reasonable possibility that the sales numbers were going to drop because of activities in Florida. Is that fair?
At this point in time, as we were seeing the activity with the DEA within the state of Florida and understanding that there was an evolving situation, I obviously felt that there was a potential for a reduction in sales, as evidenced by this email.
And in term, when you reference the activities in Florida, or the evolving situation in Florida, what was the outcome you were contemplating? What was going to what exactly was going to happen in Florida?
We really didn't know. I mean, we were in the thick of it. We really didn't know what was happening. So the DEA was communicating information, and Karen Harbour could definitely speak to that much more strongly than I could. I was in marketing. I was on the business side, but we definitely felt like something, was evolving, happening there, and we just weren't quite certain what the overall impact. And so from my perspective as a business manager, trying to understand from a dollar perspective the impact that would have to our existing sales dollars within our budget.
Do you recall when you first started scrutinizing the degree to which a distributor was over-indexed in Florida?
I don't remember, no.
But you do recall at one point that was something that Mallinckrodt started analyzing.
Well, we obviously did as a result. I mean, this email that I sent here about key source and the percentage total sales for Florida, so yes.
Now, Jeremy's response to you is this will likely take a few days, and the real challenge will be incorporating the volume that is outside of our tracked channels.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what he meant by volume that is outside of our tracked channels?
I do. So whenever we're determining market share and market size, we're utilizing third-party data sources that we purchase. So namely, one would be IMS. So my perception of his email with it saying that's outside of our tracked channels is there is prescription level data that's not available via IMS, and so we would have to ascertain what that amount would equate to. And again, Jeremy would have to, I mean, he was the expert in terms of market share analysis and pulling that data. He would be able to speak to that much better, or someone in that group would be able to speak to that much better than what I could. What I gave you is a very layman's version of it.
But is the general issue that IMS might not capture all the prescriptions? Is that what?
There are people who, there is, from my understanding, and again, you would need to speak to somebody who's more well-versed, is that there are certain non-reporting customers within the U.S. that don't report their prescription data into IMS. So IMS has to make estimations. So yes, that's my understanding.
Then the very top email on the front page, so this is on 438.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the sentence that reads, he has been comparing the share by strength for the retail channel by food chain versus independent to measure part of the at-risk volume,
Mm-hmm.
and comparing the NPA data to the NSP data to measure the rest by company.
Mm-hmm.
What does he mean by at-risk volume?
I don't know what he means. You'd have to ask Jeremy, I'm not sure.
So do we have 262710? Great, let me just grab it. Yes, I believe this is Exhibit 9. So this is an email that you sent to Karen Harper, CCing Jeremy, and it's Bates number 262710. Can you read the highlighted sentence for me, please?
Sure. He has some good insight into the external data that we will and won't be able to access in order to aid us in our analysis of the diversion situation in Florida.
And in terms of the diversion situation in Florida, doesn't that indicate that at the time you wrote this email, you believed that there was an increased occurrence of diversion in Florida?
I don't know if there was an increase of diversion within Florida. I can't speak to that. That would definitely be something you would need to talk to the DEA about. And you would also need to talk to Karen more on this because she's the one that had the direct communication with the DEA. But I think when I talked earlier, I mentioned the evolving situation, and this would be what we're referencing.
And the evolving situation relates to diversion in Florida and an increased risk of diversion in Florida, doesn't it?
I can't speak to increased risk in diversion in Florida, but we did have an understanding that there was a situation that was evolving in Florida, and we were trying to understand what we could do to impact that.
And in your words, that situation was a diversion situation, was it not?
Well, if you read the sentence that you just had me read, in order to aid us in our analysis of the diversion situation in Florida, that was my statement, yes.
And then do you see the last sentence?
I said specifically if the time comes when we actually meet with the DEA.
Okay. What was the DEA meeting that you're referencing?
I don't know, because I say specifically if the time comes when we actually meet with the DEA, so I don't know what that was referring to.
Do you know if a meeting with the DEA occurred?
I don't remember.
And so I take it you don't recall ever attending any such meeting?
I don't recall ever attending a meeting with the DEA, no.
But the end result of all of this analysis is that Mallinckrodt stopped shipping its product to distributors that were over-indexed in Florida.
That's correct. And I think that's a really important thing to note, yes.
And when you say that's a really important thing to note, why do you say that?
Because we stopped shipping to people that were shipping heavily into the state of Florida.
And that's a good thing, why?
I don't know.
So it's important to note that simply because it meant you stopped shipping, but you don't actually have any idea as to whether that was a positive thing or a negative thing?
I can't speak to what the repercussions of it were, no.
Okay. So if you have 2897. So I believe we're up to Exhibit 10. Okay, here we go. So this is another exhibit. It's an email and an attachment. The email is Bates number 289707, and the attachment is 289708.
Okay.
Okay, so here it's an email between you and Karen Harper, and you're responding to her request for $1 of sales for Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 to Florida per year.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why Karen was requesting this data from you?
I don't know why she requested this data. You'd have to ask Karen.
Do you have any understanding of why the focus on Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 as opposed to other products that were being sent into Florida?
As we spoke about earlier, so this is in September of 2010. So this would have been after the email exchange we just referred to with Jeremy Stamer talking about the Florida sales. So it would be my understanding that we pulled this to understand how the Florida sales had been trending within this particular molecule.
And why focus on this particular molecule as opposed to sales of either other opioid products or other oxy products to Florida?
Sure.
What's special about Oxy 15 and Oxy 30?
So as we've spoken about earlier, we saw that Florida was more heavily indexed on Oxy 15 and Oxy 30 milligram.
Did Mallinckrodt ever have questions about sales of Oxy 15 or Oxy 30 into other states in addition to Florida?
I don't recall questions around other states.
Do you recall concerns about other states being more heavily indexed towards oxycodone products generally along the lines of similar questions for Florida?
I don't recall discussing other states.
I'm happy to keep going, or we can break for lunch. I'm not sure what time it is.
Sure, it's about 12:15. So how about we
Okay.
break, and we typically cut down about 40 minutes for lunch, 45 minutes. You want to
Sure.
come back at 1?
So 1? Okay, that's fine.
All right, stand by, remove your microphones. The time is 12:16 p.m.